I'm really happy to be here and be able to meet with all of you. And I'm Todd Finnemore. I am a clinical geropsychologist in private practice. I do quite a bit of psychoanalytic psychotherapy with older adults. I work with adult children of aging parents. I'm embedded in Sonoma County Adult Protective Services, and I do decision-making capacity assessments for them and for attorneys and fiduciaries out in the community. Sometimes I work as an expert witness and do competency evaluations for the DA or for the public defender. I've been dedicated for many, many years to the health and well-being of older adults and their families in the community in Sonoma County and throughout California. And today we're going to talk about intimacy. So what is it? Intimacy is contact, closeness, attention, and connection, and can be emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical. That's what we'll be talking about today. Why is intimacy important for all of us? We need to feel we're a part of something much larger than just ourselves and our bodies. And knowing others and being known is essential to our human experience. And what we'll see today, I hope, is that intimacy is transformational. It's transformational for our own thoughts, helps us develop our thoughts. It's transformational for our feelings, helps us move our feelings through our bodies, and helps us with trauma and bodily sensations. Intimacy is crucial for our health and well-being as people. So as you all know very, very well, that Parkinson's disease, I'm going to focus on Parkinson's more than other chronic diseases today. Parkinson's has enormous effects on intimacy. Bradykinesia and facial masking changes the way that we're perceived by others. The vocal changes can have an effect on how we sound to ourselves and other people. Postural changes and tremors, gait changes, the twisting movements or the ongoing movements in Parkinson's can interfere with the way that we're perceived or the way that we feel. And cognitive changes in particular around who we experience ourselves to be and how we relate to others in our thoughts and feelings has an enormous impact on intimacy and requires intimacy to be held and to maintain well-being. And the autonomic effects on the nervous system, have enormous functions in Parkinson's symptoms, including sexual dysfunction, difficulty with swallowing, GI disorders, bowel and bladder abnormalcy, sleep disturbances. All of these have an effect on sexual function, as well as interpersonal relationships. One thing that I want to name in particular about my understanding of the symptoms of Parkinson's, and I'll bring it up a number of times today, is that the variability in the symptoms. It's not just that it's one way all the time, that you reach a certain water level and then another water level or another water level, that it's so variable. And the intensity of the effects on um, stress in particular, the stress in relationships due to the variability in symptoms, um, I think is incredibly important to think about together, and to be thinking about how to hold and know that, because other than or different than other disease processes, different than other disorders, um, with Alzheimer's disease, the course, of course, there's variability, but the course is a long, often long, slow decline. With Parkinson's, every day can be different. Every day is uncertain as to what's going to happen for many people. And it's in that uncertainty that there's uh, potential for an enormous amount of stress and an interference in intimacy. So what do most people want in family caregiving relationships? Like what's the context for intimacy with partners and family members um, in Parkinson's? So people want their loved ones to be okay. They want to help. They want to maintain often or go back to what was normal. They want to rely on what they have known. And difficulties arise in our hearts and in our relationships when change interferes with the status quo. So we orient to our lives and our relationships through roles: parent, spouse, teacher, carpenter, grandparent, lawyer, son, daughter, loved one, friend. Roles are archetypes and templates for who we are and what we need to do, how we orient to experience. Who am I now? How am I going to fit in? These are the roles that we have. That's how we answer that question. Each role has consciously and unconsciously associated tasks, demands, and benefits. In other words, every role has a set of responsibilities. When we can no longer fulfill a role, we feel stressed. When we depend on someone playing a role that they can no longer fulfill, we feel stressed. So I keep talking about stress. What is stress? Stress is a ratio, and it's a ratio of resources to demands. So when resources are inadequate to meet present or future demands, we feel stressed. When we feel like we have the resources to match the demands on us, often we feel better contained and more confident or more relaxed. And when I talk about resources, resources might be time or availability, or financial or emotional resources. They could be physical or cognitive resources, spiritual resources. Any of these are what we bring to adapting to our daily lives. And similarly, same as the other categories, financial demands, emotional, interpersonal demands, physical demands. When we don't have enough money to pay the bills, right? We have bills, those are the demands, and we don't have the resources to pay our bills, we feel stressed. When we want to be able to connect with someone physically, and our bodies uh, don't have the energy or aren't working in the way that they used to or the way that we expect, then the demands that we have, the wishes that we have aren't um, aren't met by the resources that are available, and that leads to high levels of stress. So when roles change in partner relationships, spouse relationships, when the roles change between a parent and child, when the demands in the relationship require a new response, or when resources don't match those demands, we can feel really stressed in our the roles in our relationships. And it turns out that the stress in our relationships is often a signal that we need a new approach. So stress is and can feel quite awful. It can be painful. It can be very uncomfortable. It can be disruptive. I think everyone um, knows the experience of stress in the body, stress in our hearts and minds. And when we're feeling stress, it's actually a good signal that we may need a new approach or may need to play a new role in our relationship with someone that we are connected with. When there's change, when there's stress or grief, when there's loss, when there are cognitive changes, when there are changes in dependency in the roles that we have between ourselves and a partner or a parent or a child. Um, Family dynamics, the relationships between people and how we hold ourselves, how we think about ourselves, and how we think about others, how we relate. Um, those dynamics are often amplified in stress, grief, and loss. That we find denial is really common when things are changing in relationships because change is very threatening. It can be too painful to accommodate, and it becomes easier for someone to rely on the defense of denial and to just say, no, that's not changing, no, that's not different, no way. And what may seem logical or rational or clear to one family member may be inaccessible to another person due to their defenses and strategies. Um, and therefore, it can actually be shocking when we run into another person's habit patterns of relating. When we have this happens in my experience quite often, that you have a caregiver caring for someone with um, a chronic illness, and you have a sibling that lives far away. And when the sibling comes to visit, that their perspective on what's happening with the parent, their perspective on what's happening around the parent's needs or around how to relate to the parent can be radically different than the person that's living there. And, it can go either way. The person that's living as the caregiver that's close in may not be seeing the reality of the situation and the reality of the changes. Or it may be that the person that comes from far away is not ready to be with the reality of the changes. And bumping into another person who's who's in denial around the changes that are happening, as a person's chronic illness continues, that in and of itself can be enormously stressful when uh, we're not even sharing the same sense of reality between each other. Like I said earlier, and as you all know very, very well, Parkinson's symptoms vary on a moment by moment basis, on a day by day basis. And although you can get dialed in certain ways, um, that for many people, they just don't know what they're going to get on a day to day basis. And so, in that ratio of demands and resources, if you never know how you're going to be functioning or what you have at your disposal, what your body is going to be like, or what your thinking is going to be like, then it's hard to know what you have for resources. It's hard to know what to rely on. And that, in and of itself, the changeability, um, contributes to enormous amount of stress in Parkinson's. So researchers have found that low levels of loneliness are associated with marriage, higher incomes, and higher educational status. So being involved and being connected, on average, decreases loneliness. And higher levels of loneliness are associated with physical health symptoms, like physical health symptoms, excuse me, living alone, small social networks, and more superficial social relationships. So living alone and being disconnected, obviously, and having more superficial relationships um, are risk factors for feeling more lonely. So just having 3 or 4 close friends is enough to ward off loneliness and reduce the negative health consequences associated with this state of mind. I, on a personal note, I did my research for my dissertation on depression in ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. And in the course of my research, one thing that I found in the literature is that for people that are more and more, I think of ALS as being quite an extreme. And when people, their motor functioning decreases, they become more and more locked in, they're able to do less and less. They can no longer swallow, they can't talk, and then they get to the point where they can't even move. That as long as they were able to endorse something, like a thumbs up, thumbs down, even communicating through blinking, that what the research found was that when someone with ALS was able to endorse, were able to say that they had a close, loving relationship, when they were able to say that they felt connected with another person, they continued to endorse high levels, high quality of life. So their sense of their own well-being and quality of life, even in the extremes of being locked in, that they found that they continued to say that they had a high quality of life if they were connected with people that they love. And in some ways, that's very common sense. And yet I found that to be life-changing, very moving um, understanding that one of the most important things for our quality of life, um, if not the most important thing, is staying connected with the people that we love, and therefore intimacy um, is uh, is directly related to our sense of our well-being and quality of life. So as we begin to change, as our loved ones begin to change, or as our own bodies and minds begin to change in Parkinson's, um, what do we do to stay connected? How do we manage the change in roles? And so first, we clarify the identified role. We clarify the role that we have held and maybe the role that is changing. And we define the responsibilities of that role. Um, and then stay open to change. And let me go back a little bit. So if we're clarifying the identified role, we want to define the role and go through the process potentially of mourning the loss of that element in ourselves as things change. If we're not able to move or speak or um, relate in the way that we had, if we're not able to function or do the things that we used to do to kind of uphold our end of the bargain in a relationship, then being first and foremost identifying that, oh, that's what I had been able to do. That's who I was. That's who I was and who I wish I could be in this relationship. And what did that entail? What were the responsibilities that that role entailed? And how might I continue to uphold those responsibilities? And if I can't, then what strategy is going to be most useful for me to hand off those responsibilities um, and or continue with um, uh, a, as straightforward and simplified version of those responsibilities as I can. First, it's identifying the role and responsibilities and then seeing what is possible and handing off what is not. So when we need to redefine our roles and responsibilities, we often need to communicate and collaborate with loved ones. So how might we do this with someone that we believe, say, for example, needs more care, or we wish to be connected with and are finding stress in the connections? So one option, one strategy in connecting with someone when there are changes in roles and responsibilities, one is open questions. For example, how do you think things are going these days for you? Or when we try to connect, what is that like for you? Big open questions can elicit a response where you can learn something about the other person's experience. Sometimes when our roles are changing, it can be useful to use, I don't know if anybody has heard this term, the feedback sandwich. So you start with something positive or concrete, a strength. You you then give the critical feedback about the change that you're noticing, and then you end with a positive strength. So something like, hey, you look really good today. I've noticed though that you might be having a hard time with the shower sometimes. Um, I know that you always enjoyed the feeling of a nice hot shower. Um, and I've always appreciated your sense of good health and well-being. So in the midst of the, the connection and the positive interaction, there's some feedback that can open up a chance to be able to talk about changes that are happening. And another example of how to initiate challenging conversations is to use opportunities that open up. Like if there's a difficulty remembering, or if there's a challenge that a person finds in being able to continue their own roles and responsibilities, or if the person is in a moment of self-reflection, then take that as an opportunity to be able to have some of these more important, although potentially challenging conversations. Obviously, we all know something about adaptation to change. But the main components of adapting to the changes involved in any chronic illness are mourning what we can't change, mourning what has changed outside of our control, strategizing to adapt in ways that we or to accommodate in ways that we can, and collaborating and communicating, because ongoing independence, for us to be independent people, actually means learning how to rely on other people. So when we have a good fit between the demands on us and the resources in life, this leads to greater well-being and happiness. What the research shows, and my experience with people shows, that the elements that are important to focus on for intimacy and sex in Parkinson's are communication, focusing on staying close, patience with each other, um, focusing on the reality of sex itself, both the emotional and physical elements of sex itself, to be aware of hypersexuality and compulsive behavior that can happen in Parkinson's, and equally, if not most importantly, is expanding the definition of intimacy. And I'll touch on each one of these. So first, 1 out of 6 people taking a dopamine agonist develop compulsive behaviors, which might include being very demanding for sex, having a desire for sex at what would be socially inappropriate times or interpersonally inappropriate times. People have affairs or impulsive or compulsive behaviors. And there's pretty high incidence if you think of like 1 out of 6. And so I just wanted to name this and put it out there to your group, because if and when this happens for any of you or for your loved ones, that it can be recognized and named between you or with caregivers. And then strategies can be found around the more intense elements in the pressure that can be there around sex, and that this can be brought to your medical providers and psychologists, um, medical providers in particular, around um, medication management in Parkinson's. And so, this is something to be aware of, and that it can be treated as a knowable and um, um, an element that can be discussed between yourselves and with providers. And along those lines, one important element in sex and Parkinson's, intimacy in Parkinson's, is working with your providers around any sexual dysfunction or any challenges that might come up around sexual intimacy, physical intimacy in Parkinson's. And yet what the literature shows is that patients and caregivers often downplay the effects of Parkinson's on intimacy with medical providers. And understandably, it can be a very tender topic and can be really embarrassing to talk about. But in all relationships, sexual health and intimacy are, it says vague, sorry about that, very important for health and well-being. And primary providers, psychologists, and social workers often can help people with sexual dysfunctions or helping guide the any challenges there might be, and improve the situation um, around sex. And including these topics when connecting with your providers is really important. So in one study, it was found that normative discussions around heterosex, gender, age, illness, and dying contributed to sexuality being positioned as irrelevant or inappropriate. And what all of that means actually is that for providers, that providers actually, with their own discomfort, will often avoid the topic of sex and physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, unfortunately. And so it's important for all of you to be empowered to bring that up with your providers. Providers will very often feel very open to discussing it when it's brought up, but they will often hesitate to bring it up themselves for a long list of reasons. And so I invite you, when you're speaking with your providers, to talk to them about any concerns or questions you have about sex. I've talked quite a bit about change and stress and roles. But in Parkinson's, a lot of people don't talk about the changes that they're feeling or the changes that happen. Maybe they're happening so fast and they're so broad ranging that it's hard to name and talk about them. But the communication as an element in intimacy is really essential. I mean, communication is in many ways what intimacy is. And as facial expressions change, or emotional states change, or functioning changes, everybody in the relationship may have doubt or insecurity around those changes. And for each of us to learn to practice how to express our frustrations with each other, to learn how to ask for what you need, and to bring empathy to our partners and our loved ones, is essential for intimacy overall, and a new approach to intimacy, especially sexual intimacy in Parkinson's. Like I said before, intimacy includes emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical closeness and contact. Um, so changes in facial expressions and body language require alternatives to visual contact, the visual understanding of how a person is feeling. It's much harder to understand, and it may be harder uh, to even understand our own felt sense of ourselves. Um, so communication and affection through touch, using feeling words, learning to express what may be chaotic feelings or partially formed ideas, to put that out there um, in maybe a less packaged form. These are all important to replace or bolster the decrease in what we might have understood from each other from the way that our facial expressions were clear, or the way that our body language was clear. We may need to translate what we had been able to understand with each other into a different mode, like touch or using certain words to express feelings. So to stay close requires scheduling time with each other in this crazy modern world we live in, to remember the things that you can still enjoy together at any stage in the progress of Parkinson's. Um, and because Parkinson's can be so unpredictable, it really requires, flexibility, adaptability, patience, and compassion with each other, as well as developing many forms of affection. One thing that stands out in the literature about intimacy and Parkinson's um, is that it's, and maybe this is obvious, but I think it's important to really name it and note that it's the quality of the contact, it's the quality of the conversation, it's the quality of the touch and affection that improves intimacy and decreases isolation and loneliness. Um, and it's the subtleties around authentic connection that can be what people struggle with, but it's that authentic, even connecting and communicating about what is unpleasant or what may not be easy or might not always be nice, that it's that authenticity that really will deepen intimacy. I think we've all been dealing with this for the last year. Um, I think Zooming and social distancing has created a barrier. It's opened up connections that we might not have been able to have, but it's also, this very two-dimensional setup between people, and it's an isolation from another body. And so, with family members, with a spouse, with caregivers, um, we can rely on, Zooming with each other, FaceTime, to have some connection, and it can be wonderful. But um, I think the chronic Zooming without actually being with someone, to be able to hold their hand or to be in physical contact, has really um, added to people's chronic stress over the last year of COVID. And as things open up, uh, you know, not having contact at all, of course, is much more stressful. Zoom and FaceTime can really add to a person's sense of connection. And yet, once we're all vaccinated, um, being able to be in physical contact with each other, I think, and in the same physical space will go a long way to decreasing stress and increasing intimacy. In the tradition of psychoanalysis and attachment theory in psychology, there's a really terrible word, or at least it seems awkward to me, called mentalizing. It sounds almost 19th century, or as if someone is mesmerizing you or hypnotizing you, but that's not really what it means. It's a term that means holding someone in your heart and mind, thinking about their experience, and empathizing. So what a parent, what a mother does with their infant, when the infant's crying, the mother picks them up and holds them and thinks, and is curious. So, oh, wait a minute, what is this crying? How does it feel for me? And what do I think this child needs? They need, oh, are they wet? Are they hungry? Are they cold? Are they lonely? Are they overstimulated? What does this person need? And similarly, with each other, this function of mentalizing, of empathizing, of holding another and imagining another person's experience is one of the most direct ways that we can increase authentic communication and increase intimacy. It's by contacting, empathizing, and imagining, and then having something to say to the person about what we imagine, about their experience, that increases intimacy. It's holding and knowing another person in our thoughts and in our hearts that increases intimacy. In a similar way, one thing that I've practiced with people, even in more severe symptoms of dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, when someone isn't even able to string together a sentence, they're not able to put words together, they're maybe even delusional, they're no longer living in the breadth of their experience. They're living very, very much in a very small window of the moment. But one thing that lasts for people is their connection with their feelings, their felt sense of themselves, and their emotional response to each other. And so one thing that increases intimacy, I've had long conversations with Alzheimer's patients that can't communicate verbally in an organized fashion. And the way that I've been able to have these long conversations is by taking in what they have to say, taking in any words that they're saying, but feeling in my body, feeling into and imagining what the emotion is that's in the content of what they're saying, in their story. Are they frightened? Are they excited? Are they happy? Are they angry? And responding to the feeling rather than to the content or the narrative. So to say something like, well, that sounds really frightening, or I'm really glad that you're so happy with that. That those are empathetic, emotionally laden responses that then can develop and create a feeling to feeling or emotion to emotion, heart to heart communication with another person. And it often is, I would say always, but I'll stick with often, is the heart to heart connection that feels most intimate. When someone is taking in and understanding what you're feeling and saying something back to you about how they're feeling, or is clearly understanding how you're feeling, that It's that heart-to-heart connection that feels most intimate. So in a very concrete way around sex and intimacy in Parkinson's, I'll leave this up. I won't go through all of them right now, but here's a list of some concrete guidelines and recommendations about sex in Parkinson's. So don't be afraid to ask for help. Practice communicating about sex between partners. Make a plan. It doesn't feel very spontaneous sometimes, but make a plan. Learn how to adapt physically. Maybe even relearn something about your own bodily sensations. And most importantly, I think, is practice developing and expanding our sense of intimacy with each other, our sense of closeness with each other by mourning roles, by adapting to changes, and by holding and being together in the stress of the changes that are happening. So in expanding the definition of intimacy in Parkinson's, intimacy, as you all know, is not just about sex, and eroticism isn't just intercourse. That closeness, feeling known and knowing your partner is one of the most essential goals in intimacy. And it turns out that disruptions to the status quo can actually lead to increased intimacy. A family caregiver one time said to me, my parents were perhaps more emotionally intimate in those last years than in the entire 65 years of their marriage. So sharing yourselves with each other, the good and the bad, small acts of physical affection, and continued development of how you communicate through adversity will allow intimacy and connection to help transform stress.